The Old West was an untamed and unpredictable place, not quite as chaotic as movies show, but still filled with unique challenges. Moving westward meant facing dangers unseen in the more established East Coast. Disease, violence, and mysterious disappearances were all part of daily life as settlers ventured into new territories. Life on the frontier exposed people to unusual risks, and death often came in unexpected ways. Here's a look at 9 bizarre and surprisingly common causes of death during the settlement of the Wild West. Could you have survived? Maybe not.
You got drunk. Alcoholism was a widespread issue in the Old West. At that time, people did not have a clear understanding of the physical and mental health problems that came with long-term alcohol use. Unlike today, there were no rehabilitation centers or substance abuse treatment options. As a result, it was common for people to develop serious alcohol dependency, leading to destructive behaviors later in life. The story of Calamity Jane serves as a notable example of this problem. Once a well-known and respected figure on the frontier, she was closely linked with Wild Bill Hickok. After Hickok's death, she remained in Deadwood, South Dakota. Over time, she began to drink heavily, her alcohol use increasing as others exploited her fame from her frontier days. Calamity Jane's drinking became so severe that it drew the attention of local newspapers, which struggled to find polite ways to describe her behavior. By 1903, just before her death, the Sioux Valley News published a piece that bluntly addressed her situation. They noted that when Jane drank, she tried to relive the old frontier days by causing trouble in town. However, times had changed, and her behavior led to frequent arrests. The newspaper described how she often ended up in the town's jail alongside other individuals arrested for public intoxication. Calamity Jane passed away a few months later from pneumonia in the small town of Terry, South Dakota, near Deadwood. Her life and struggles with alcohol highlight the challenges faced by many in the Old West, where limited understanding of addiction and lack of support systems made it easy to fall into a cycle of dependency. The reality of frontier life, with its hardships and isolation, often drove individuals to alcohol as a means of coping, further complicating the lives of those already dealing with difficult circumstances. Vanishing into thin air. If all these unusual ways to meet your end weren't enough, you might consider simply vanishing without a trace. This is what happened to Charles Earl Bowles, known to many as Black Bart, and his story remains one of the Old West's most enduring mysteries. During the mid-19th century, Bowles earned his nickname, inspired by the infamous pirate Black Bart from a bygone era, which suited him well. He became notorious for his string of stagecoach robberies across the western frontier, committing at least 28 such heists over the years without being apprehended. Remarkably, Bowles earned a reputation as a courteous bandit. He targeted strong boxes and bank funds but never stole personal belongings from the passengers. Eventually, his luck ran out. Sheriffs in Northern California managed to capture him during one of his attempted robberies, and he was swiftly brought to justice. Bowles was sentenced to 4 years in the well-known San Quentin prison for his crimes. When he had served his time and was released, he seemed to have vanished into thin air. He mentioned to those around him that he was done with his life of crime and then walked away, quite literally, into the sunset. After his disappearance around 1888, Bowles was never heard from again. Some historians speculate he lived until at least 1914, but his whereabouts and lifestyle during those years remain unknown. This uncertainty reflects the nature of the Old West. In those days, with no computers, smartphones, or surveillance cameras, it was entirely possible to disappear completely and live under the radar. For someone like Bowles, who was adept at eluding capture, slipping into obscurity would have been just another part of his mystique. His story highlights the freedom and anonymity that were possible in the Old West, a time when a person could easily leave behind their past and start anew, far from the prying eyes of society. A horse. Many individuals in the Old West built their reputations by doing one or two brave or risky things, and they lived off the stories of those events for the rest of their lives. Bill Pickett, however, faced danger almost every day. Born in the 1870s, he was one of the last true frontiersmen, living at a time when the Old West was beginning to change. Pickett gained fame for a skill called bulldogging. While he might not have been the first to do it, he certainly mastered the art. Pickett was renowned for his ability to leap from a horse onto a wild steer and wrestle it to the ground. This was an incredibly risky maneuver, requiring not only skill, but also tremendous courage. Unfortunately, it wasn't bulldogging that ultimately led to Pickett's demise. In 1932, while trying to rope a horse, the animal became uncontrollable. It kicked him and then trampled him after he fell. Pickett succumbed to the injuries from this incident. Such incidents were not uncommon for those who worked outdoors and handled horses regularly during that era. Horses, despite their training, were large, powerful, and could be unpredictable. Even the most experienced handlers faced the risk of sudden accidents. Pickett, an expert in managing animals, could not escape this unfortunate fate. If a seasoned cowboy like Pickett could meet such an end, it underscored the ever-present risks of working with animals on the frontier. This reminds us that life in the Old West was full of uncertainties, where even the most skilled individuals had to navigate the constant dangers of their environment. You got an STD. Life for men working on ranches and driving cattle in the Old West could be incredibly isolating. Surrounded mostly by other men and dealing with tough, often dangerous conditions, they had little opportunity for social interaction. So when these cowboys finally made it to a town, even one with the most basic amenities, it was a chance to let loose. They would head straight for the local saloon, indulge in some very strong alcohol, and seek out the company of the so-called painted ladies. Prostitution was widespread in the Old West, especially in towns where women were otherwise scarce. It wasn't heavily regulated by the local authorities, and many saw it as a normal way for men who had spent long periods in the wilderness to unwind. After weeks or months of hard work on the trail, spending time with a woman was viewed as a well-earned break. However, this way of life had significant risks. One major issue was the spread of infectious diseases. Wild Bill Hickok, a famous figure of the Old West, suffered from such a disease in his later years. Symptoms of what was likely syphilis troubled him greatly, affecting his ability to urinate and even impairing his eyesight. At that time, penicillin had not yet been discovered, and medical care was hard to come by in the remote towns of the frontier. As a result, venereal diseases spread rapidly. The problem was exacerbated by the fact that many women who worked as prostitutes traveled from town to town, potentially passing infections to different groups of men. For anyone living in the Old West, giving in to these temptations often meant facing serious health problems later on. This reality highlights the challenges of life on the frontier, where limited medical knowledge and care could turn what seemed like simple pleasures into significant health risks. The Old West was a place of both opportunity and danger, where personal choices could have lasting and serious consequences. Bar fight. In the Old West, it was all too easy to make enemies. Many people on the frontier spent their days gambling, often playing card games like poker. These games could quickly lead to disputes over winning hands and money, which sometimes turned into serious conflicts. The story of Wild Bill Hickok is a classic example of how gambling could lead to dangerous rivalries. In his later years, Hickok settled in the town of Deadwood, South Dakota, where he tried to make a living as a gambler in the town's saloons. One day during a poker game, he went up against a man named Jack McCall. Hickok had a winning streak that day and ended up taking all of McCall's money at the table. Feeling some sympathy for McCall, Hickok even gave him a few dollars back for a meal before heading on his way. Hickok hoped this gesture would smooth things over, but McCall felt humiliated and angry after being bested in front of others. The next day, McCall returned to the saloon, approached Hickok, and shot him, ending his life immediately. This type of deadly confrontation was not uncommon in the Old West. While not every conflict ended in such a dramatic fashion, long-standing grudges often led to violent outcomes, sometimes escalating from arguments to physical altercations. The absence of consistent law enforcement in many frontier towns meant that disputes could easily spiral out of control, leading to fatal encounters. Life on the frontier was often governed by personal codes of honor and revenge, rather than by the rule of law. In an environment where tensions were high and lawmen were few, disputes over something as simple as a card game could quickly turn lethal, highlighting the unpredictable and sometimes perilous nature of life in the Old West. You got sick. This one might seem straightforward. People get sick and eventually they pass away. It's a harsh reality. But in the Old West, 3 specific illnesses were particularly dangerous: dysentery, diphtheria, and cholera. While dysentery and diphtheria could be severe and potentially deadly, it was cholera that was often the most feared, as it was nearly always fatal. Due to the lack of proper sanitation in the Old West, cholera could spread rapidly, often through contaminated food and water. Once it began to spread, it was difficult to control, leading to many people falling ill in a short period. The initial symptoms of cholera were deceptively mild, starting with severe but painless diarrhea. At first, this might have seemed more of a nuisance than a serious health threat. However, the real danger came as the illness progressed. The constant loss of fluids led to extreme dehydration, which became difficult to manage, as the body could not retain enough water. This dehydration could then cause severe complications, including kidney failure, which often resulted in death. With no effective medicines available to treat cholera and a lack of hospitals or proper care facilities, once the disease took hold, recovery was rare. Cholera's contagious nature made it even more deadly. If someone in a wagon party contracted the disease, it could quickly spread to others, putting the entire group at risk. Without the ability to isolate the sick effectively, it wasn't uncommon for whole groups of travelers to succumb to the illness within days. This reality paints a stark picture of life on the frontier. The threat of dying from dehydration and organ failure, miles from help on a desolate trail, was a grim possibility that many faced. These harsh conditions illustrate the challenges and dangers of the Old West, where the lack of medical knowledge and resources made the fight against disease a losing battle for many. You were attacked by settlers. Dying in the Old West was not only a reality for Americans heading west to settle new territories. Indigenous peoples, who had lived on those lands for centuries, faced their own devastating losses. As settlers pushed further into the frontier, Native Americans were displaced from their ancestral lands, confined to ever smaller areas. This expansion led to significant conflicts, and Native communities were caught in the crossfire. The U.S. cavalry, backed by considerable military force, often clashed with Native American tribes. These confrontations, known as the American Indian Wars, spanned several centuries and had a profound impact on indigenous populations. The result was a dramatic reduction in their numbers and the forced relocation of surviving members to reservations. These reservations were often remote and provided few opportunities for sustainable living, leading to significant hardships. One of the most tragic examples of this conflict was the attack on the Camp Grant Apaches. On April 30th, 1871, a group composed of white settlers, their Mexican allies, and members of the nearby Tohono O'odham tribe launched an assault on the Apache camp in southern Arizona. The attack took the Apaches by surprise, leading to a significant loss of life. In the aftermath, at least 150 Apaches were captured and sold into slavery to ranchers and villagers in Mexico. The attackers justified their actions by claiming that the Camp Grant Apaches had been conducting raids that threatened the interests of white settlers in the Tucson area. However, this attack was not just about retaliation. It marked the end of an entire way of life for the Camp Grant Apaches, a small tribe that has since faded into obscurity. Understanding these events gives us insight into the profound impact of colonization on Native American societies and the complex history of the Old West. You died in a drunken duel. Gunfights are a staple of Western films, but the quick-draw duels often depicted are not an accurate representation of how things typically happened in the real Old West. The cinematic portrayal of duels is overly stylized, with too many formalities and rules to be true to life. The classic image of two men facing off on a dusty street, walking away from each other, counting steps, and then turning to shoot from the hip is more a creation of Hollywood than a historical reality. Such orderly showdowns were exceedingly rare. In reality, most gunfights in the Old West were far more chaotic and unplanned. They usually started with a heated argument, often fueled by alcohol, inside a saloon. Instead of a structured duel, these confrontations spilled out into the streets, where the participants, often intoxicated, would fire at each other in a haphazard and frantic manner. The idea of duels as calm, controlled events set against a backdrop of eerie music and drifting tumbleweeds simply did not align with the messy and unpredictable nature of real-life conflicts in the Old West. These shootouts were not the carefully orchestrated events seen in movies. More often than not, they involved two drunken individuals ducking behind barrels, horses, or any other available cover, shooting without much aim or precision. The lack of sobriety almost guaranteed poor marksmanship, putting not just the duelists at risk, but also bystanders, animals, and property. Stray bullets could easily hit innocent bystanders or damage nearby buildings, illustrating the danger and disorder of these events. Wyatt Earp, a famous figure from this era, captured the essence of these situations in his autobiography. He noted that in these chaotic encounters, the person who remained calm and deliberate was more likely to come out unscathed. Earp's insight highlights a critical aspect of gunfights in the Old West. Success relied more on composure and careful action than on the speed of drawing a weapon. The myth of the Old West duel is a testament to how stories evolve over time, becoming more dramatic and sanitized. The reality, however, was far less glamorous and much more unpredictable, characterized by a lack of sobriety and an abundance of rash decisions. Understanding this gives us a more nuanced view of the challenges and dangers faced by people living on the frontier. You hanged. Hangings were not exclusive to the Old West. They had been practiced in America for many centuries and were common in various other parts of the world as well. However, during the time when America was expanding its frontier toward the Pacific Ocean, hangings became a frequently used form of execution. In today's world, we generally consider more humane approaches to the death penalty, reflecting how our views on justice and punishment have evolved. Yet back in the Old West, hangings were a common response to criminal activity, particularly for those labeled as troublemakers or outlaws who found themselves apprehended by local sheriffs in remote rural towns. The legal system in the Old West was quite different from what we have today. There were fewer judges, limited court access, and not many trained attorneys available to provide legal representation. The frontier was a place of transition, filled with people who were either traveling to new destinations or starting over after not finding success in the eastern parts of the country. In such a setting, being caught for serious offenses often meant facing the gallows without much of a defense. The process was swift, with little in the way of formal trials, which led to a quick conclusion for many accused individuals. The intention behind hangings was to ensure a rapid end for the condemned, ideally by breaking the neck from the drop, resulting in an immediate death. The idea was to create a procedure that was both efficient and, by the standards of the time, relatively painless. This method of execution was seen as practical and straightforward, qualities that were highly valued in the rough and unpredictable environment of the Old West. Although it did not always go as planned, and some suffered more than intended, hanging was considered effective enough to be the predominant form of capital punishment for many decades. In the rapidly changing and often lawless landscape of the Old West, establishing a sense of order was a priority, even if it meant bypassing the complex legal protections that we take for granted today. As a result, the gallows became a symbol of frontier justice, embodying the harsh realities of life in a land where survival often depended on taking decisive and sometimes extreme measures.
Please like and share if you find the video content interesting and useful. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment below so as not to miss the upcoming interesting videos. Thanks for watching.